Dear Senator Kennedy, I write to you today from the city of Daejeon in the Republic of Korea, and I will speak plainly, just as you would have it. My name is Kim Sun-gi, and I am a 49-year-old elder, known in our Methodist tradition as a Kwanzaa, serving faithfully at Daejeon Jel Methodist Church. By day, I work as an operations support manager at a senior welfare center, caring for the elderly members of my community. By night and on weekends, I operate a small YouTube channel called Sun Patriotic TV, where approximately 7,200 subscribers join me in prayer and advocacy. I am, by any measure, an ordinary man living an ordinary life, in a nation that has been blessed by its friendship with the United States for more than 7 decades. Senator Kennedy, you are famous for saying that our country was founded by geniuses but is being run by idiots. You have made a career of speaking truth to power, of cutting through political double-talk, of asking the questions that need to be asked. You have said that you just try to speak in a way that people can understand, and that the American people think that most politicians live in La La Land. I write to you because tyranny is unfolding in the Republic of Korea, and someone needs to tell the truth about it. A 69-year-old pastor named JEON Gwang-HOON has been imprisoned for 70 days as of today, March 23, 2026. He now requires a urinary catheter because his body can no longer perform basic functions. He cannot walk without assistance. The charges against him have been criticized by the presiding judge himself as unclear and insufficient. Yet he remains behind bars while the president of South Korea openly declares that religious involvement in politics must be completely uprooted. This letter you now hold in your hands is the 23rd international letter I have written to American leaders pleading for Pastor JEON's release. I have written to President Trump, Vice President Vance, Secretary Rubio, Speaker Johnson, and numerous senators including Lindsey Graham, Ron Johnson, and Bill Hagerty. Today I write to you, Senator Kennedy, because I believe that you, more than almost anyone else in the United States Senate, will see this situation for what it truly is and will have the courage to say so plainly. You do not sugarcoat the truth. You do not engage in political doublespeak. When something is wrong, you say so. What is happening in South Korea is wrong, and it needs someone like you to call it out. Senator Kennedy, I address you specifically because you are known as the most quotable senator in America, a man who speaks truth with the charm of a Southern gentleman and the precision of an Oxford-trained lawyer. You have said that you trust Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea like you trust a Jussie Smollett police report. You have told judicial nominees that just because they have seen my cousin Vinny does not qualify them to be federal judges. You have described some Washington politicians as having billy goat brains and mockingbird mouths. These are not merely clever quips. They reflect a worldview that values plain speaking over political correctness, substance over spin, and truth over comfortable lies. This directness is precisely what the situation in South Korea requires. President Lee Jae-myung has publicly declared that religious involvement in politics is the path to national ruin and must be completely uprooted. He has compared pastors who engage in political speech to armed rebels committing treason. He has called for investigations into Protestant churches as a category. He has used an agricultural metaphor that should chill the blood of anyone who values religious freedom when plowing a field. He said, "You remove the big stones first, then the small ones." Pastor JEON is the big stone. His imprisonment is meant to clear the way for broader persecution of all religious voices that oppose the regime's agenda. Senator Kennedy, I need someone who will call this what it is. I need someone who will say plainly that a treaty ally of the United States is engaging in religious persecution. I need someone who will point out that comparing pastors to armed rebels is the language of authoritarian regimes, not constitutional democracies. I need someone who will ask why the United States is silent while a pro-American pastor languishes in prison with a catheter in his body, unable to walk. While the president of his country threatens to uproot religious citizens from political life. You are that someone. Your voice carries across America and around the world precisely because you speak truths that others are afraid to speak. The situation in South Korea is not complicated. A pastor spent 7 years organizing peaceful rallies where participants sang hymns, prayed, recited the Lord's Prayer, and waved American and Korean flags to celebrate the alliance between our nations. Not one act of violence was initiated by Pastor JEON or his followers in 7 years. Not one, yet he has been arrested, thrown in prison, and left to deteriorate physically while the prosecution struggles to articulate exactly what crime he committed. The judge has publicly criticized the case, but still Pastor JEON sits in prison, dying slowly, while the president speaks of uprooting religious voices like weeds from a garden. This is tyranny, Senator Kennedy, plain and simple, and someone needs to say so. Senator Kennedy, your extraordinary academic credentials give you a unique perspective on matters of law and justice. You graduated magna cum laude from Vanderbilt University, where you were president of your senior class and elected to Phi Beta Kappa. You earned your law degree from the University of Virginia School of Law, where you served as an executive editor of the Virginia Law Review and were elected to the Order of the Coif. And then you went to Oxford University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, where you earned a Bachelor of Civil Law degree with first-class honors from Magdalen College, studying under some of the greatest legal minds in England. This background in law makes you particularly well suited to understand what is happening in Pastor JEON's case. On February 27, 2026, the presiding judge in Pastor JEON's trial, Judge Park Ji-won, openly criticized the prosecution's case in open court. The judge stated that the charges were unclear. He stated that the specific perpetrators of alleged crimes had not been identified. He stated that the prosecution had failed to establish how Pastor JEON's words led to any specific illegal acts. The judge told the prosecution, in open court, that they should reconsider their indictment. This is an extraordinary statement from a sitting judge, a clear signal that the case against Pastor JEON is fundamentally flawed. You have built a reputation on the Senate Judiciary Committee for asking basic questions that expose whether judicial nominees actually understand the law. You asked Matthew Peterson about the Daubert standard and motions in Lemine, and when he could not answer, his nomination was withdrawn. You have said that just because someone watched Judge Judy does not make them qualified to be a federal judge. You understand that the law matters, that procedure matters, that the rule of law is not just a slogan, but a set of practices that protect citizens from arbitrary power. In South Korea, the rule of law is being twisted into a weapon of political persecution. Pastor JEON is being held in prison despite a judge's criticism of the charges because political leaders want him silenced. This is exactly the kind of abuse that the rule of law is supposed to prevent. Senator Kennedy, you have also shown that you are willing to hold nominees of your own party accountable. When President Trump nominated Matthew Peterson, Brett Talley, and Jeff Mateer, you helped expose their lack of qualifications or their problematic views, and all 3 nominations were withdrawn. You have said that presidents from both parties have nominated some duds, and that senators cannot afford to overlook unqualified nominees because they are accountable to the people of their states. This even-handedness shows that you care about the integrity of the law, not just partisan advantage. I ask you to bring that same commitment to integrity to the case of Pastor JEON, where a fellow democracy is abusing its legal system to persecute a religious leader. Senator Kennedy, I am deeply moved to address you as a fellow Methodist. You and your wife Becky are founding members of North Cross United Methodist Church in Madisonville, Louisiana. You have publicly stated that you are a Christian and believe that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, and that this belief informs every decision you make and your commitment to serve the public. This shared faith gives me hope that you will hear my appeal not only as a matter of foreign policy or legal principle but as a matter of Christian conscience. I too am a Methodist, serving as an elder at Daejeon Methodist Church in South Korea. Our Methodist tradition has always emphasized both personal piety and social engagement. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was not content merely to save souls. He also fought against slavery, advocated for prison reform, and spoke out on the social issues of his day. The Methodist heritage teaches us that faith without works is dead, that loving God means loving our neighbors, and that Christians have not only the right, but the duty to engage in the public square on behalf of justice and righteousness. Pastor JEON Gwang-HOON, though Presbyterian in his own tradition, represents this same vision of engaged Christianity. He spent 50 years in ministry, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ and shepherding congregations. He rose to become the president of the Christian Council of Korea, representing millions of believers across thousands of churches. And when he saw his country drifting toward accommodation with communist North Korea, and away from its traditional alliance with the United States, he felt called to speak out. His weekly rallies at Gwanghwamun Square were not political protests in any conventional sense. They were worship services held in public, where believers gathered to sing hymns, to pray, and to express their gratitude for the freedoms that the U.S. Korea alliance has protected for 70 years. Senator Kennedy, when President Lee Jae-myung declares that religious involvement in politics must be completely uprooted, he is attacking the very foundation of Christian civic engagement. He is saying that believers must stay silent while the government pursues policies that violate our values. He is saying that faith has no place in public life. This is contrary to everything our Methodist tradition teaches. It is contrary to the American understanding of religious freedom enshrined in the First Amendment, and it is contrary to the basic principles of constitutional democracy. As a fellow Methodist and a fellow Christian, I ask you to speak out against this attack on religious liberty, in a country that is supposed to be America's ally and friend. Senator Kennedy, your reputation as a watchdog of taxpayer money and a critic of government overreach makes you particularly well positioned to understand the dangers of what is happening in South Korea. You have built your career on holding powerful institutions accountable, on asking tough questions, and on refusing to accept comfortable answers. Your book, How to Test Negative for Stupid, which held the top spot on the New York Times bestseller list for 3 weeks in late 2025, reflects your conviction that too many people in positions of power are making decisions that defy common sense and basic decency. The Lee Jae-myung administration in South Korea represents exactly the kind of government overreach that you have spent your career opposing. This is a government that has imprisoned a 69-year-old pastor for exercising his constitutional right to free speech. This is a government whose president publicly compares religious leaders to armed rebels and calls for investigations into churches. This is a government that is pursuing policies to dismantle the U.S. Korea alliance, including the abolition of the National Security Act, the early transfer of wartime operational control, and potentially the withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea. And this is a government that has silenced the most prominent Korean voice defending the alliance by throwing him in prison. Senator Kennedy, you have often pointed out that government power can be abused when there is no accountability. You have said that no one wants to find themselves fighting for their freedom before a judge who thinks the U.S. Constitution is the name of a ship. In South Korea, Pastor JEON is fighting for his freedom before a legal system that has been weaponized against him. The judge has criticized the prosecution's case, but the prosecution continues anyway. The pastor sits in prison with a catheter, unable to walk, while the president of his country speaks of uprooting religious voices. This is what happens when government power is used to silence dissent rather than to protect the rights of citizens. I ask you to bring the same skepticism about government overreach that you apply domestically to this international situation. When a treaty ally of the United States begins imprisoning religious leaders for peaceful advocacy, that is not a domestic matter that falls outside America's legitimate interests. It is a fundamental betrayal of the values that are supposed to underpin the alliance. It is exactly the kind of abuse of power that the United States should speak out against, just as it speaks out against similar abuses in countries that are not allies. Silence in the face of such persecution suggests that America's commitment to religious freedom is negotiable, that it applies only when convenient, that allies get a pass when they persecute believers. Senator Kennedy, your service on the Senate Judiciary Committee gives you a unique platform to address issues of religious freedom and human rights. The Judiciary Committee has broad jurisdiction over matters relating to federal criminal law, human rights, immigration law, and constitutional rights. As a member of this committee, you have direct access to the mechanisms that the United States uses to promote human rights abroad and to hold violators accountable. You have the ability to raise questions, to demand briefings, and to shine a spotlight on abuses that might otherwise go unnoticed. The International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 established religious freedom as a priority in American foreign policy, and created mechanisms for responding to persecution around the world. This law recognizes that religious freedom is not merely an American value, but a universal human right, and that the United States has a responsibility to advocate for persecuted believers regardless of where they live. Pastor Joon's case falls squarely within the concerns that animate this law. He is a religious leader being persecuted for his faith and his advocacy. The charges against him are pretextual, designed to silence his voice rather than to punish any genuine crime. And the president of his country has made clear that this persecution is part of a broader agenda to uproot religious involvement in political life. Senator Kennedy, I respectfully request that you raise Pastor Joon's case in the context of your work on the Judiciary Committee. Ask what the State Department is doing to address religious persecution in South Korea. Ask whether the Commission on International Religious Freedom has examined the Lee administration's statements about uprooting religious involvement in politics. Ask whether the United States has communicated any concerns to the South Korean government about the treatment of Pastor Joon. These are questions that deserve answers, and your position on the committee gives you the standing to demand them. I also ask that you consider working with your colleagues to introduce a Senate resolution condemning religious persecution in South Korea, and calling for Pastor Joon's release. Such a resolution would send a powerful message that the United States Congress is watching, that the treatment of religious leaders matters, and that allies are not exempt from American expectations about human rights. Your reputation for plain speaking and your willingness to cross party lines when principle requires it would make your support for such a resolution particularly significant. Allow me to tell you about the man for whom I plead. Pastor JEON Gwang-HOON was born on March 28, 1956, in a Korea that was still recovering from the devastation of war. He grew up in a nation that had been liberated from Japanese colonial rule by American soldiers, defended from communist aggression by American blood, and rebuilt with American aid and friendship. From his earliest days, Pastor JEON understood that the freedom he enjoyed was not free, that it had been purchased at tremendous cost by those who believed that liberty was worth defending. This understanding shaped his entire life and ministry. Pastor JEON answered God's call to ministry more than 50 years ago. He has spent his entire adult life preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, shepherding congregations, and calling his fellow Koreans to lives of faith, integrity, and service. He rose to become the senior pastor of Sarangjel Church, one of the largest and most influential Protestant congregations in Seoul. He served as the president of the Christian Council of Korea, the largest Protestant organization in the nation, representing millions of believers across thousands of churches. He became a voice not just for his own congregation, but for the entire Korean Protestant community, speaking out on matters of faith, morality, and public concern. Beginning in 2019, Pastor JEON began organizing weekly rallies at Gwanghwamun Square in the heart of Seoul. These were worship services held in public gatherings where tens of thousands of Koreans would come together to sing hymns, to pray, to recite the Lord's Prayer, and to sing the Korean national anthem. They would wave Korean flags alongside American flags, celebrating the alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea that has been the cornerstone of Korean security and prosperity for 7 decades. Some participants also waved Japanese flags, recognizing the importance of trilateral cooperation in maintaining regional peace. For 7 consecutive years, from 2019 to 2026, Pastor JEON led these weekly rallies without a single incident of violence. Hundreds of thousands of participants gathered peacefully to worship and to express their patriotism and gratitude for the alliances that protect their freedom. Not one act of aggression was initiated by Pastor JEON or his followers. Not one. Senator Kennedy, you have said that you like to speak plainly so that your constituents who do not follow the nuances of government can understand the issues. Let me speak plainly. Pastor JEON is a man of peace who has been imprisoned by a government that fears his message. There is no evidence of any crime. There is only a government that wants to silence the most prominent voice defending values that the government opposes. Yet despite this record of peaceful advocacy, Pastor JEON has been relentlessly persecuted by successive leftist governments in South Korea. Under the administration of President Moon Jae-in, which governed from 2017 to 2022, Pastor JEON was arrested and imprisoned 3 separate times. He was charged with an astonishing 76 criminal offenses ranging from election law violations to public safety infractions. The cases dragged on for years, consuming his time, his resources, and his energy. And in the end, after all the investigations, all the trials, and all the appeals, Pastor JEON was found not guilty on every single charge. All 76 accusations were dismissed by the courts as politically motivated, lacking in evidence, and fundamentally unjust. This pattern of persecution has now resumed with even greater intensity under the administration of President Lee Jae-myung. On January 13, 2026, Pastor JEON was arrested yet again. The original charges of incitement to insurrection were sensational and alarming, designed to paint Pastor JEON as a dangerous radical seeking to overthrow the government. But these charges quickly collapsed under scrutiny. There was no evidence of any plan to overthrow the government. There was no evidence of any violent conspiracy. There was no evidence of anything beyond a 69-year-old pastor exercising his constitutional right to speak freely about matters of public concern. The selective nature of his prosecution is evident from the fact that the Supreme Prosecutor's Office initially rejected arrest warrants for both Pastor JEON and another leader, Representative Shin Hae-sik, due to insufficient evidence. It was only after political pressure from the highest levels of the Lee administration that the warrant for Pastor JEON alone was approved, while Representative Shin remained free. Senator Kennedy, you have spoken about the importance of treating everyone equally under the law. You have criticized prosecutors who decline to prosecute some offenders while aggressively pursuing others. What is happening to Pastor JEON is exactly the kind of selective prosecution that undermines public trust in the legal system. He is being targeted not because of what he did but because of who he is and what he represents. Senator Kennedy, you once said that the difference between men and dogs is that dogs do not allow the dumbest and most inept members to become leaders of the pack. In South Korea, the legal system is being led by prosecutors who cannot articulate a coherent case, who have been criticized by their own judge, and who are proceeding anyway because political leaders demand it. This is not justice. This is persecution dressed up in legal robes. And someone needs to say so plainly. Senator Kennedy, I must now speak to you about a matter of urgent and grave concern. Pastor JEON Gwang-hoon is dying. His health conditions were already serious before his imprisonment, but 70 days of incarceration have accelerated his decline to a critical point. If action is not taken soon, Pastor JEON may not survive to see his vindication in court. The next hearing is scheduled for April 17, 2026, nearly a month away. There is a real possibility that he will not live to see that date if he remains in detention. Pastor JEON suffers from a serious spinal condition called OPLL, which stands for ossification of the posterior longitudinal ligament. This is a progressive disease in which the ligament that runs along the back of the spine gradually turns to bone, compressing the spinal cord and causing neurological symptoms. Pastor JEON has undergone 3 separate cervical spine surgeries to address this condition. Metal screws and plates have been permanently implanted in his neck to stabilize his spine. This condition requires ongoing monitoring by specialists, access to advanced medical facilities, and careful management to prevent catastrophic complications. The stress and inadequate care of prison are exactly what his doctors would warn against. In addition to his spinal condition, Pastor JEON has long-term diabetes with multiple serious complications. His heart function has deteriorated as a result of years of diabetes. Most critically, he suffers from neurogenic bladder dysfunction, a condition in which nerve damage affects the bladder's ability to function properly. Senator Kennedy, I must be direct with you, as you would want me to be, Pastor. JEON now requires a urinary catheter because his body can no longer perform basic elimination functions on its own. He cannot urinate without medical assistance. A tube has been inserted into his body to drain his bladder. He cannot walk properly without assistance. He has been transferred to the medical ward of the detention facility, a sign that even the prison authorities recognize the severity of his condition. At his trial on February 27, 2026, Pastor JEON himself made a statement that should haunt everyone who hears it. He said that if the trial had been held on the originally scheduled date of March 20th, he might have actually died. This is a 69-year-old man with a catheter in his body warning the court that continued imprisonment may kill him. Senator Kennedy, you have said that you try to speak so plainly that people can understand. Let me speak plainly. Pastor JEON is being slowly killed by imprisonment for a crime that even the judge says has not been proven. This is not justice. This is state-sponsored cruelty against an elderly religious leader. Senator Kennedy, I must now tell you about the man who is responsible for Pastor JEON's imprisonment, and who poses a direct threat to the values that the United States and South Korea are supposed to share. President Lee Jae-myung took office in 2025 after a tumultuous political period that saw the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol. Lee represents the progressive left wing of Korean politics, a movement that has historically been skeptical of the U.S. Korea alliance, sympathetic to engagement with North Korea and China, and hostile to the influence of Protestant Christianity in Korean public life. His presidency represents a fundamental challenge to the democratic values and alliance commitments that have defined South Korea for decades. On January 21, 2026, just 8 days after Pastor JEON's arrest, President Lee held his New Year press conference. His statements about religion should alarm every defender of religious freedom around the world. President Lee declared that religious involvement in politics is the path to national ruin and that it must be completely uprooted. Senator Kennedy, consider those words carefully. The President of South Korea, a constitutional democracy and America's treaty ally, announced publicly that religious citizens who engage in political speech must be completely uprooted. This is not the language of democracy. This is the language of authoritarian regimes that view religion as a threat to state power. President Lee continued his attack on religious freedom with increasingly alarming rhetoric. He compared religious leaders who engage in political speech to armed rebels committing treason. He said that using the religious system as a political tool is absolutely impermissible, comparing it to giving someone a gun to protect the country only for them to point it at the people. Senator Kennedy, you have said that you do not engage in political double-talk. So let me be direct. President Lee is comparing pastors who lead peaceful prayer rallies to soldiers who turn their guns on their own people. This is incitement against religious leaders. This is creating a climate in which persecution can be justified as a matter of national security. This is exactly the kind of rhetoric that has preceded systematic religious persecution throughout history. President Lee then went further, calling for investigations into Protestant churches as a category. He stated publicly that some Protestant churches should probably be investigated and that the government should naturally proceed with investigations. This is religious targeting of the most blatant kind. The president of a democratic nation, America's treaty ally, is calling for investigations into churches not because of any specific evidence of wrongdoing, but simply because they are Protestant churches that have engaged in political speech. Senator Kennedy, you have fought against the abuse of prosecutorial power throughout your career. What is happening in South Korea is the abuse of prosecutorial power on a massive scale, directed at an entire religious community. President Lee's most chilling statement reveals the strategic nature of his attack on religious freedom. He used an agricultural metaphor that exposes his true intentions. He said that when plowing a field, you remove the big stones first, then the small ones. Senator Kennedy, Pastor JEON Gwang-HOON is the big stone. He is the most prominent Protestant leader in South Korea, the former president of the Christian Council of Korea, the organizer of the largest pro-American rallies in the nation. By imprisoning him first, the Lee administration is sending a message to every other religious leader: speak out, and you will be next. This is not law enforcement. This is systematic intimidation of an entire religious community. The pattern of tyranny extends beyond rhetoric to concrete policy. The Lee administration is pursuing what Pastor JEON has called the 5 major policies, each of which would fundamentally undermine the U.S. Korea alliance and threaten regional security. First, the abolition of the National Security Act, which has been the foundation of South Korea's defense against North Korean infiltration and espionage since the early days of the Republic. Second, the early transfer of wartime operational control from the combined U.S. Korea command structure to Korean command, without ensuring that Korean forces are fully prepared to assume this responsibility. Third, the potential withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea, the 28,500 American service members whose presence has deterred North Korean aggression for decades. Fourth, the dissolution of the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, the institutional embodiment of the alliance that ensures seamless coordination between American and Korean forces in the event of conflict. Fifth, the abolition of the Defense Counterintelligence Command, which would leave South Korea vulnerable to penetration by hostile intelligence services. Together, these 5 policies represent a systematic dismantling of the alliance architecture that has kept the peace in Northeast Asia for 70 years, and Pastor JEON has been the most prominent voice opposing these policies, which is precisely why he has been targeted. Senator Kennedy, you have often noted that Washington seems to be run by people who lack common sense. What is happening in South Korea defies common sense. An allied government is imprisoning the strongest Korean advocate for the U.S. Korea alliance while pursuing policies designed to weaken or sever that alliance. An allied government is comparing religious leaders to armed rebels while calling for investigations into churches. An allied government is using its legal system to persecute political opponents while ignoring judicial criticism of its own cases. This is not how democracies are supposed to behave. This is how authoritarian regimes behave, and someone needs to say so. Senator Kennedy, the relationship between President Lee Jae-myung and the Chinese Communist Party deserves particular attention. While President Lee speaks of uprooting religious involvement in Korean politics, he has shown a very different attitude toward China. His administration has moved to improve relations with Beijing, even as China continues to threaten Taiwan, militarize the South China Sea, and undermine the rules-based international order. The contrast is stark. Korean Christians who support the U.S. alliance are to be investigated and uprooted, while the Chinese Communist Party is to be accommodated and appeased. You have said that you trust Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea like you trust a Jussie Smollett police report. This healthy skepticism about authoritarian regimes is exactly what is needed in analyzing the situation in South Korea. President Lee's policies align remarkably well with what China would want from a South Korean government: weakening of the U.S. Korea alliance, removal of American forces from the peninsula, dissolution of combined command structures, and silencing of pro-American voices. Whether this alignment is intentional or merely coincidental, the effect is the same. The Lee administration is pursuing policies that serve Chinese interests while persecuting Koreans who advocate for American interests. The 5 major policies that Pastor Jun has opposed would transform South Korea from a stalwart American ally into something closer to a neutral or even a Chinese-leaning state. The abolition of the National Security Act would remove legal tools for countering North Korean and Chinese influence operations. The withdrawal of U.S. forces would eliminate the physical presence that symbolizes American commitment to Korean security. The dissolution of combined command structures would end decades of military integration that make the alliance effective. These are not minor policy adjustments. They are fundamental changes that would reshape the strategic landscape of Northeast Asia in ways that benefit Beijing and Pyongyang at America's expense. Senator Kennedy, Pastor Jun understood what was at stake, which is why he spent 7 years organizing rallies that celebrated the U.S. Korea alliance and opposed these destructive policies. His imprisonment is not incidental to the Lee administration's agenda, it is central to it. As long as Pastor Jun was free, he could mobilize hundreds of thousands of Koreans to resist the dismantling of the alliance. With Pastor Jun in prison, the opposition is weakened and demoralized. The big stone has been removed from the field, and now the smaller stones can be dealt with one by one. This is strategic persecution designed to clear the way for a fundamental reorientation of South Korean foreign policy, away from the United States and toward accommodation with America's adversaries. Senator Kennedy, I come to you not merely with a problem but with specific requests for action. You have built your career on getting things done, on asking the right questions, on holding the powerful accountable. I ask you to bring those same skills to bear on behalf of Pastor JEON Gwang-HOON and the cause of religious freedom in South Korea. The following steps are within your power, and each would make a meaningful difference. First, I request that you issue a public statement expressing concern about religious persecution in South Korea and calling for Pastor Jun's release. Your voice carries weight precisely because you are known for speaking plainly and truthfully. A statement from Senator John Kennedy saying that what is happening in South Korea is wrong would resonate around the world. It would let the Korean government know that the international community is watching, and it would give hope to Korean Christians who feel that they have been abandoned by the country they have long admired and supported. Second, I request that you raise the issue of religious freedom in South Korea in the context of your work on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Ask the State Department what it is doing to address this situation. Ask whether the United States has communicated any concerns to the Korean government. Ask whether there will be consequences if Korea continues down this path. Your position on the committee gives you the standing to demand answers, and your reputation ensures that your questions will not be ignored. Third, I request that you work with your colleagues to consider a Senate resolution condemning religious persecution in South Korea, and calling for Pastor Jun's release. Such a resolution would be a powerful statement of American values and would put the Korean government on notice that its behavior is unacceptable. Your willingness to work across party lines and your reputation for integrity would make your support invaluable in building a coalition for such a resolution. Fourth, I request that you share Pastor Jun's situation with President Trump. You have noted that President Trump personally asked you to stay in the Senate rather than run for governor of Louisiana in 2019, and you have supported the president throughout your career. Pastor Jun is one of the strongest supporters of President Trump in all of South Korea. His rallies celebrated President Trump's approach to North Korea and his commitment to strong alliances. A word from you to the president about Pastor Jun's case could make an enormous difference. Fifth, I request that you discuss this matter with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who shares your commitment to religious freedom and your understanding of authoritarian persecution. And sixth, I humbly request that if possible, you might help facilitate an opportunity for me to brief members of Congress or the State Department directly on the situation in Korea. Senator Kennedy, I close this letter with a personal appeal from one Methodist to another, from one Christian to another, from one person who values plain truth to another. You have built your life and career on the conviction that honesty matters, that speaking truth is a duty, and that those in positions of power must be held accountable. I share those convictions, and I believe that this moment calls us to act on them. The Bible teaches us in the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, verses 8 and 9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy. Pastor June cannot speak for himself from his prison cell. He lies there with a catheter draining his body because his organs are failing. He cannot walk to the courtroom without assistance. But you can speak for him. You have the voice, the platform, and the position to make a difference. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verse 36, records the words of Jesus, I was in prison and you came to visit me. And when the righteous ask when they saw the Lord in prison, he answers, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Pastor June is in prison for his faith and for his defense of the alliance between our nations. He is suffering for values that you and I share. Speaking for him, fighting for his release, this is the work of faith put into action. You once said, always be yourself, unless you suck. Senator Kennedy, you do not suck. You are a man of principle, a man of faith, a man who speaks truth when others are afraid. I ask you to be yourself in this moment. I ask you to do what you have done throughout your career: ask the hard questions, speak the uncomfortable truths, and hold the powerful accountable. Pastor JEON Gwang-Hoon needs your voice. The cause of religious freedom needs your voice. The U.S. Korea Alliance needs your voice. And the truth needs someone who is willing to speak it plainly, without apology, without equivocation, without fear. I am just an ordinary man, Senator Kennedy. I work at a senior welfare center in a mid-sized Korean city. I earn a modest salary. I have no political power, no great wealth, no famous name. What I have is a keyboard, an internet connection, and an unshakable conviction that right will ultimately prevail. I have written 23 letters to American leaders, because I believe that somewhere, somehow, one of these letters will reach a person who can make a difference. You are known for asking the questions that others are afraid to ask, for saying the things that others are afraid to say. I believe that you may be the person who can help save Pastor June's life and preserve the values that both he and you have dedicated yourselves to defending. Thank you, Senator Kennedy, for taking the time to read this letter. I know that you receive countless communications from constituents and advocates, and I am grateful that you have given this appeal your attention. I pray that God will guide your decisions and that He will use you as an instrument of justice and mercy in this situation. Pastor June, in his prison letter, reminded his followers of President Syngman Rhee's rallying cry, unite, fight, win. These words sustained the Korean people through the darkest days of their history. They can sustain us now. I ask you to unite with us in this cause, to fight for religious freedom and the rule of law, and to help us win the release of Pastor JEON Gwang-Hoon before it is too late. I pray for Pastor June, that God will sustain his failing body, strengthen his unbroken spirit, and bring about his swift release. I pray for the people of South Korea, that they will find the courage to resist the forces of tyranny, and to defend the freedoms that so many sacrificed to secure. I pray for the United States and South Korea together, that the alliance forged in shared sacrifice and sustained by shared values, will endure this test and emerge stronger than before. And I pray for you, Senator Kennedy, that you will be blessed in your service to Louisiana, and to the nation, that your wife Becky and your son Preston will prosper, and that you will always have the wisdom to know what is right and the courage to say it plainly. You have spent your career speaking truth to power. I ask you now to speak truth about what is happening in South Korea, to call out tyranny by its name, and to stand with the pastor who is dying in prison for defending the values that America and Korea are supposed to share. With deepest respect and urgent hope, I remain your humble servant in Christ, Kim Sun-gi.